Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the session on Innovation to Execution, How to Scale Digital Clinical Trials Globally. I am Ram Yeleswarapu, Senior Vice President at Indegene, and I lead the Enterprise Clinical R&D Services for the company. And it is my pleasure to welcome Avik Pal, founder and CEO of ClinioPs, a company that has been at the forefront of digital innovation with multiple patents in clinical trials. Avik has led transformative work enabling offline eSource and decentralized data capture in some of the most challenging geographies across Africa and low and middle income countries, helping bridge the digital divide to make trials more inclusive and efficient. Their work embodies exactly what we'll be talking about today, turning innovation into scalable real-world execution in clinical research. Avik, it's great to have you here. Look forward to this conversation.
My pleasure, Ram. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So to just set the context and tee this up, moving digital transformation in clinical trials from small isolated pilots or proof of concepts to a truly well-executed scale requires shifting the focus from individual tools to integrated themes. And today we will discuss 3 high-impact themes and actionable ideas for enabling digital transformation at scale in clinical trials. And we'll emphasize integration, security, and cultural adoption. So let me just lay down the 3 themes quickly at the beginning. Theme 1, we'll talk about unified data and process orchestration, which is the single source of truth. And moving on from there, we will get into human-centered design for global site and patient adoption. Very, very meaningful because of the aspect of patient-centricity and reducing the burden on sites and patients. We have to do justice to this topic of human-centered design for global site and patient adoption. And third theme is, how are we empowering the future-ready workforce? We have the technology, we have the data, we have the networks. The trials are getting more global, they're getting more complex, they're getting more stratified. How do we create the workforce of the future to ensure that the scale that we are aspiring to get to does indeed get accomplished? With that, Avik, let's go to theme 1. Let's talk a little bit about unified data and process orchestration. We talked about like the single source of truth. And my point, Avik, is there are too many siloed applications out there, whether you use a technology solution for e-consent or one for, let's say, a remote visit or a remote monitoring. Don't you think the focus should be on creating a backbone that actually connects all the data and streamlines the workflow? What are your thoughts on this topic, Avik? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ram. And absolutely, as you rightly said, I mean, you touched on a very important point, which is the single source of truth, right? Now, being in Silicon Valley at the forefront of innovation, one of the things that I realized a lot is that yes, innovation is important, but trust is even more important, right? Now, how do you build that trust? And when you're building trust across diverse geographies and global trials and stuff like that, it's not that easy. What works in one country may not work in another. What works in one way of doing things may not work in another. So we have taken some of these innovations that FDA has published over the years and kind of operationalized it for global adoption. For example, FDA published the eSource guidelines, but we have taken it to offline eSource. What that means is eSource is important, but the ability to collect data electronically at the point of care in certain geographies where internet is not readily available or not trustworthy is difficult. So decoupling the dependency of network and the ability to function at an optimal level is what we focused. Now with that, we have kind of scaled in more than 35 plus countries, many of the LMIC and African countries as well. And the same also works true, Ram, in some of the high-end hospitals in the US. What we've realized is, sometimes networks are blocked because of PHI, security, safety, and other concerns. So when the researchers are going from bed to bed, room to room, patient to patient, floor to floor, they don't have network connectivity. So they flip back to paper. Now, the ability to collect data offline using mobile tablets, digital tablets, actually enables that adoption at a much more broader scale. I can take another example. FDA published several guidelines on DCT, but DCT in the context of global adoption, again, we have kind of improvised it to hybrid DCT. What that means is, when DCT was kind of rolled out, it perceived as data will be collected by patients from the convenience of home, right? But in many geographies, that may not be very feasible. They may not have internet at home. They may not have digital literacy at home. They may not even have cell phones at home, right? So, but there are countries where, health worker model is very convenient. So the researchers can actually go to patient home and collect the data. So it's another way of collecting data in a decentralized fashion. It is very similar to the phlebotomist model in the US, where the researchers or some mobile nurses go to patient home and collect blood samples. So we've kind of taken all of these learnings and experiences over the years and evolved this for a much more broader scale adoption.
Fantastic, Avik. Some fantastic points. Sorry, you were about to say something. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying back to you.
Yeah, no, I think these are some fantastic points, Avik. Clearly, I think, as we said, trials are kind of increasingly going more global. Obviously, there are patients who have a dire need for safe, effective, and affordable therapies, and they're waiting. So what can we do as responsible citizens of this industry to ensure that technology works seamlessly? We don't overcomplicate the matters. And of course, we'll get into that in theme number 2, Avik. But for a moment, I want to kind of take a step back, right, and move up the value chain. When I'm looking at, for example, the efforts underway in the industry around creating the machine-readable digital version of the protocol, namely the ICH M11 standard of the protocol, to me, that's a great start of capturing biomedical concepts to make it easy and ensure that nothing gets lost in translation. We're all referring to these biomedical concepts in the same standardized, homogenized manner. So essentially defining systems based on the machine-readable protocol and trying to automate some of the systems and the handoffs of data and the connectivity from one technology to another, I believe the glue would be the machine-readable protocol. And if all of us are reading off of the same protocol, the machine readable or the same music sheet, I think the orchestra will play better, in my opinion. Otherwise, I see a lot of siloed technologies being utilized right now from sponsor to sponsor, CRO to CRO. Sometimes sponsors have a preference, CROs have a preference, but this is what is creating a diverse, disintegrated tech environment where the handoffs are not smooth. And if the handoffs are not smooth, there's no continuity of collection, perhaps challenges with data integrity as well, right? And you kind of brought up a very important point, obviously, the offline connectivity. If the network infrastructure and the overall infrastructure is not necessarily, or it is suboptimal in certain countries or regions, it always helps to have an offline mode of collecting data and then syncing it up to online repositories without compromising on data integrity. Those are some valuable points for sure.
Yeah. So
maybe we just get on. Go ahead.
Sorry. One thing I want to kind of touch on that. I mean, today, Ram, I mean, if you look at the landscape, we have a lot of acronyms, EDC, CTMS, CTMF, randomization. So if you go on that track, when you're collecting, so you configure a database, and then when you're collecting data for CRF, you say we go to EDC. We're collecting data for consent. It's all point of care data collection. You go to another application. If you're collecting data for randomization, we go to another application. If you're collecting data for patient-reported outcome, we go to another application. So it's very, very fragmented, pointed, siloed kind of approach, and then connected on the back end through APIs and all that stuff. But to your point, a single source of truth, a unified way of collecting all these data, so that the orchestration is far more seamless, is extremely important.
Absolutely, Avik. I mean, today, if you look about trying to run trials much more efficiently and effectively, you look at obviously an easy to understand protocol, the endpoints are understood, the data points you're collecting based on the endpoints you want to get to or the objectives you want to get to are simplified. You're only collecting what is required. Then you have to translate and ensure that those get codified into data capture solutions and systems. And the rollout essentially happens smoothly after that. It's not just about trying to get from a final protocol to a first patient in and getting ready for that. But subsequently, the entire study conduct phase has to be smooth. And the ability for reviewers, to ensure that there is auditability, traceability, etc., that should certainly be paramount, right? And then seamless connection of technologies using the single source of truth concept that we're talking about would certainly kind of hold a great significance and value. That said, perhaps we can just get on to maybe the second theme, Avik. Switching on to things like human-centered design for global site and patient adoption. Many a times, of course, and even continuously, we keep hearing about sites being burdened with a lot of research work coming at them, while they're obviously primarily focused on providing care to patients. And then, of course, the burden on patients itself. If in the earlier theme, we talked about simplifying the protocol, making it machine readable, simplifying using biomedical concepts, tried to promote health literacy and promote and advocate the understanding of the protocol, the risks and motivations of the trial itself to patients and researchers, then how can we make this more patient-centric? And how can we lessen the burden on sites? How can we provide, for example, training assets, for example, and a protocol undergoes an amendment, how quickly can we ensure that the rollout happens, the training on the back of it happens smoothly, so on and so forth. And likewise, to patients, for example, Avik, you brought up the concepts of decentralized trial elements. If the protocol is constructed in a hybrid manner, certain visits and certain procedures are performed at the site and certain others are done at the patient's homes, that will obviously be reducing the burden. So what are your thoughts around patient-centric efforts and reducing the burden on sites? Thoughts and themes or ideas that you could suggest, Avik, would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. So Ram, I think you mentioned two important points, and one we keep talking about: patient centricity, patient burden, blah blah blah. But not very often we actually talk about site burden. We kind of assume that they are trained people, they should be able to figure it out and stuff like that, and put the burden on the sites. But I think we should talk of both of those on the same token, right? For the patients, when you're designing technologies for patients, in tier 2, tier 3 cities in the US, or in rural villages in Africa and other places, we should not assume all the that they are literate, they have access to all these latest and greatest technology and so on and so forth. But over the years, working in more than 35 plus countries across the last 10, 12 years, we've also realized that we should not also underestimate these patients. I mean, what we have seen is they have leapfrogged from the web-based, net banking kind of model to mobile payments. What that tells you is they have trust in these mobile systems. They understand what is an app. They know what is a username and password, right? And because they're trusting their money on it. So on the other hand, we have seen that many of these nurses and doctors are very, very efficient in what they do. But maybe they do in a paper-based model, and in terms of collecting all this data through paper CRFs and so on and so forth. So if you put the two in together, which is, if they can do it through an app where they can log in and see that data, and then once they log in, they see almost a replica of what they're used to on paper, then it becomes, kind of gives you magical outcomes. So the adoption curve then becomes so much more easier. So what we're doing is we are understanding their perception of what works for them. We are respecting their kind of UI UX understanding. So we're not changing drastically that mobile means something wholly alien. No, it's not. It's just basically continuation from paper to digital paper, if I may. Also, to your point of trust, we have to understand their local languages. So multilingual support is important. Help desk in their local language is important. Understanding of their culture is important. Simple things like, we collect gender and we write, sex, male or female. It's a taboo in many countries. Instead, we can write gender, male and female. So just the understanding of how they work gives you more, acceptance and adoption in many places.
Absolutely, Avik. Some fantastic points there. May I just ask you for perhaps in your own experience, right, in having rolled out and being a part of some very large global trials where the patient populations are enormously large and these are multi-year trials. Could you share any quick examples or case studies, particularly in the context of, let's say, LMICs and or regions of the world where the infrastructure maybe is suboptimal for connectivity, etc.? Any specific examples you can think of, Avik? That would be helpful for our
yes.
audience.
Yeah. So we have done many such mass scale broad rollouts. I mean, these are in the range of 30,000-40,000 patients as well, in multiple different countries, in many different languages we don't even understand, right? But how do you support trials in those regions and cases? So one example I can take of is a 38,000 patient study on lymphatic filariasis, where the patient's legs get swollen, so they are not mobile and cannot move. So the nurses would go to the patient home and collect the data, right? And we have seen some, marvelous results there, and many of them are actually published in very high-end journals. Some are, treated by very respectable people from our industry. One of the things that we learned is that the ability to collect data digitally at the point of care in complete offline mode with all the checks and balances built in has significant downstream impact from just the collection, right, into data management, biostatistics, monitoring, travel, source data verification, and so on and so forth. To a point where this is a real example where in a similar study, we have seen about 100 queries per patient. These are like 50, 60 CRFs, unique CRFs, and many multiple repeat CRFs over a period of 5 years. Came down from 100 queries per patient down to just 2 queries per patient. So it's not like a incremental shift, but a pragmatic shift that completely changes the way you work downstream in terms of how many queries you need to resolve versus how many travel you need to make, how many edit checks you have to kind of fix, and so on and so forth. So we have seen some extremely great results. I can take another example. This is in a high-end country, about 7-8 sites in Europe. It's an oncology study with one of the top top 2 pharma company in the world, where the requirement is very different. It is about GDPR compliance. So here the patients are collecting the data, in this case, some skin rash cancer study, skin cancer study. And those images are being analyzed by the sites, but if they don't send these rashes, they need to be notified. But then to notify a patient, there's a dependency on either a phone number or an email, which both go against the requirements of GDPR as PHI data, is sitting on the database. So how do you navigate these things, right? And so there are intelligent ways how we can do that. So we did that, and not only we are able to reach the patient in real time without having any PHI info, but also translate some of this content into French, Spanish, German, and all these different languages in real time. So to be able to kind of remind them to take those images, send it back to them. So there are many such examples where we've done this at scale in different variations or flavors of using technology. Technology is at our fingertips now, and it can do wonders what it could have done maybe 10 years back, 20 years back. So it's moving at a rapid scale, and we'll see more of these down the line.
Excellent examples and use cases, Avik. Thank you for sharing those with us. So this takes stock of what we have covered thus far. We talked about, obviously, small-scale pilots, for example, proof of concepts using technology to set up and conduct trials. In a hybrid setting, we talked about elements of the technology could be, or functions could be decentralized to ensure we are kind of providing relief and lessening the burden on patients. We briefly talked about the ICH M11 version of the machine readable protocol, bringing us all onto the same page when it comes to understanding what's being defined there, what's to be collected, what are our objectives or endpoints we're targeting, so on and so forth. So that uniformity of language and harmonization helps quite a bit. And then systems can then be fed off of course, the M11 aligns to CDISC USDM, and ultimately the SDR as a repository will start feeding the downstream systems. So even if the technology, for example, comes from multiple different vendors, in the context of a clinical trial, if they're reading off of the same source, which is the machine readable version, and defining their solutions and defining their systems in accordance with that, it makes it easier for everybody to understand, which essentially means we're not retrospectively trying to go back and do translation or conversions and what have you. Otherwise, in today's environment, a lot of time is getting wasted in collecting data. Then you go back and start converting the data to conform to certain data standards before analysis can begin. But if we all start collecting data in a very unified, standardized manner, then the downstream steps can actually be eliminated, reduced, or ultimately eliminated. But that brings up an interesting point, which is theme number 3 for us, Avik, for today's discussion. With all of the change in technology, the adoption of standards, we talked about, for example, multilingual capabilities, rolling out these solutions. You talked about number of queries being dramatically reduced compared to conventional processes and technology. What kind of a future-ready workforce should we be thinking about in the industry? I mean, what we're talking about right now would require upskilling, reskilling, and in some cases, using artificial intelligence and AI agents working hand in glove with human in the loop that calls for a different set of skills altogether. So I can think of a few examples right away. When it comes to reading off of like a machine readable M11 version, maybe builds can be reduced. The entire ECOA to EDC to the setup of the systems, etc., can at least be done by agents, with the humans kind of taking on a review role, for example. And then if you continue down, for example, if you're kind of collecting all of the data in a standardized format, the ability for data managers who are currently called data managers in their current role, they could evolve to become perhaps data scientists. And what are they looking for? They're looking for insights. They're not doing the mundane, very mechanical query management kind of a thing, but rather they moved on to something which is far more insights driven, asking the right questions, looking for anomalies, looking for outliers and exceptions, and making the calls for a potential CRA of the future, upskilled and reskilled, to actually make a visit to the site only when absolutely necessary. And you're not getting into things like source data verification, source data reviews, but you're actually visiting the site to ensure that, hey, do they need any help? It's more about providing oversight and guidance and a hand-holding rather than kind of looking at checks and balances. But let me pause here, Vic. What are your thoughts about empowering and creating this workforce of the future, the upskilling and reskilling required? How do we in the industry come together to ensure we are kind of, again, playing to the same music sheet, as I said earlier, and then ensure that this rollout is truly global? Because that's our topic, from pilots to global large-scale execution. Over to you, Vic. Thoughts?
So, Bram, we can learn from history. So, just like process automation kind of revolutionized manufacturing industry, I think intelligent agents will also revolutionize how we redefine clinical operations of the future. Right. So, to coming back to a point, if we take the workforce required for clinical trials, we are looking at the site level, and then we are looking at the CRO/sponsor level, right? So, at the site level, we have to recognize that change management is difficult, right? So we have to make it as seamless as possible from the technology perspective, adoption perspective, so that many of the things are happening in the background. Right? So they're not prompted to make a whole new shift in their mindset and so on and so forth. Just a simple example, traditionally, let's say data is collected on paper and blood pressure is collected by 70 and by 120, and you make a mistake and write 720 instead of 120. Patient leaves, your paper goes into binder, into folder, into cupboard, and then later you transcribe it in an EDC, you collect it, you capture it, recognize that there was an error. You call the patient and redo the whole thing. Right? Now, can that same person enter the data on a tablet, and the moment you enter 720 in complete offline mode, it pops up and say, hey, this is out of range, please fix it. So they look at the screen, change it back to 120, and audit trail captures that change, and the patient leaves. And you save a return of that patient later. Imagine doing that at scale for 40,000 patients. So much of recalls are just saved. So much of edit checks are saved, and in terms of downstream. But the same person can do that activity without doing a whole lot of change, right, in terms of adoption. So you talked about upscale, you talked about cross-skilling. A lot of these will apply both at the site, but I think a lot of these will also apply at the CRO level, at the sponsor level. And there, I think this whole sorry to say, but let's say a little mundane job or kind of low-scale jobs will all be gradually shifted to AI agents, right? And AI agents will be an enabler for the data managers to be more efficient, to take on more, handle more trials at the same time. And as you rightly said, kind of focus more on the insights or outcome-driven rather than input-driven, where they're kind of entering data into 5 different places. No, an AI agent will take care of that, or you design a system when that's not even necessary.
Absolutely, Avik. You're right. I mean, the industry has been operating in the same manner for a substantial amount of time. I think
Yes.
with the advent and the power of technology, I think we have the ability to shift to newer roles, upskill and reskill our workforce, prepare for the future. The future is here, by the way. It's happening around us already. Which also brings another point, Avik, I'd like to make. The leadership that is actually looking at development plans, right, within the biopharma sponsor environment, right, the kind of metrics they should be looking at with these kind of changes you and I have been discussing, the kind of metrics they need to look at to measure the success, the return on the investment, and decisions that they need to make, perhaps those metrics need to change as well. Because suddenly we are not looking at the same conventional standardized reports and dashboards and metrics, but on the back of an agentic AI interspersed with human in the loop kind of activities, I think clearly those metrics and the measurements of success have to be looked at differently. In closing, Avik, as we get to the end of this session, any remarks that you would have?
Sure. I think, as you rightly said, some of these metrics will change, right? So I think it'll be more outcome driven rather than input driven. That will evolve. AI agents will definitely play a lot of role in the future, especially repeatable jobs, jobs that are binary, yes, no, 0, 1 kind of activities, and the high skilled will more focus towards outcomes and insights and so on and so forth. Ram, I would also like to add one other thought on the closing, which is more kind of ethical, if I may, that when we run these clinical trials, and let's say at the end of the 2-year period or 3-year period or 6 months, they come to an end. Many of these are terminally sick, cancer patients. What happens to them after the trial is over? If the drug was actually working, they see hope. But the moment they get off the trial, they are only countdowning the terminality. Right? So I think at some point, clinical trial and clinical care should converge. And maybe it's already happening around us, but we need to recognize that as well and figure out a better way to, as we talk about all these technologies and AI agents and workforces and so on and so forth, there's a huge workforce on healthcare that we can tap on. There's a huge workforce on clinical trials and life sciences that are more closer to what we do, but they also can eventually evolve and converge towards down the line, 5 years, 10 years from now.
Well said, Avik. I think you made a very powerful statement there. What happens in clinical trials obviously is for a finite period, but those patients roll off and they go into the real world. What happens to them at that point? And today we're trying to kind of close the loop between R&D, clinical development, as well as real world. And we do an extensive number of studies to continue to gather evidence from real world data sources. But certainly, I think we should be thinking collectively as an industry about how to close this loop and ensure that the patient at the end of the day benefits. So by focusing on these 3 core areas, I would like to sum it up by saying that an integrated data and technology environment. Of course, we talked about patient-centric user experience. Ultimately, that burden on the patients and the sites needs to be reduced for large-scale adoption. And of course, we also touched upon workforce readiness. I think by doing these 3 things, the themes that we had established earlier, one can successfully, we believe at least, can transition from running successful one-off pilots to achieving, for example, scalable and standardized digital transformation across an entire clinical trial portfolio. Avik, thank you very, very much for spending the time and for this wonderful discussion. I hope we'll leave our audience with the thoughts of saying, if they are doing pilots, they have one-off siloed environments that they're kind of dealing with, what kind of ideas or themes that they can pursue to be able to kind of harmonize and integrate all of that to perhaps scale them up and execute at a global level for the benefit of our patients who are waiting for safe, affordable, and effective therapies. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.